Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, best intentions fail. Why is the inclusion of many students with a disability in schools not working? And the AFL tackles internal divisions over its support for same-sex marriage. Joining me on the panel, lecturer in education at Newcastle University, David Roy. Welcome back.
Thanks, Ellen.
The Chief Executive of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, James Pearson. Good to see you, James.
Ellen.
And a new guest in Melbourne, 2017 Young Australian of the Year for Victoria, Jason Ball. Hello, Jason. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum and on Facebook. What does inclusion really mean? And is it pie in the sky and ideal for schools? A landmark inquiry in New South Wales into students with a disability or special need has found that inclusive approach to education is not the reality experienced by many of those students. Though there were examples of excellence, the inquiry found deep cultural problems in the sector. Teachers and principals with no effective training in special education, and the sense among parents that finding a school for their child isn't a basic right, but a lottery. Our reporter Stephanie Bolchi met two families who've struggled with the system.
We know that ours is not an isolated story, so I wanted to make sure that his experiences were told so that hopefully other children will avoid the kind of things that he experienced in his first year of school.
A mother of 3 children with autism, Melanie Hayworth, is one of the few parents who gave public evidence at the inquiry. She tried 2 schools for her eldest son, Will. At the first, he experienced benign neglect.
We found that the school was very ignorant of autism and its meaning for Will, and also wasn't really prepared to do the sorts of things that would actually make a difference to William and to his experiences of school and to his happiness.
Dr. Hayworth says when the school leadership didn't listen to her repeated concerns, she feared that any further complaints would cause friction in the classroom, so they moved on. But the second school just floundered.
Even though with all the best intentions and love, he still felt isolated and he still felt very alone at school, in a way that I think is endemic in the system, and it wasn't a fault of a particular school.
Dr. Hayworth told the inquiry that despite the rhetoric of inclusion in mainstream schooling, there is a gross disparity between inclusion and the lived reality. So now she homeschools Will.
And I have heard of particular great schools, but I think on a systemic level, there is a long way before we are able to get that.
Parents say it's a lucky dip with schools. Rebecca McKeon says her daughter's first experience of school was disastrous.
Our 2 experiences personally have been like chalk and cheese. The first, I sat back thinking, if this is how the state my daughter's in by term 3 of kindergarten, how on earth do I get her through 13 years of school?
Ashley has severe inattentive ADHD. Her mother says the classroom teacher was willing to work with her to understand Ashley's needs, but she met roadblocks from the principal.
As a parent, when things go wrong for your child in a school, you feel really alone. You feel like you have this big system that you need to battle with almost.
So she turned to the education department for advice, and despite being told they wouldn't contact the principal, they did.
I think the biggest fear about making any complaints is that ultimately you'll become that parent who might be given some lip service answers, but that ultimately your child will actually suffer as a result of you making complaints.
David, a lot of familiar frustration for you there coming from those parents. You and your wife were instrumental in getting this New South Wales inquiry into special education underway. So we started this attempt to have children with additional learning needs integrated into our schools in the mid-1970s.
Yep.
And now we have this finding that inclusion isn't the reality for many.
Yes.
How hard was it to shake that clear and honest statement out of the system?
It's been a battle, and I have to give credit actually to the number of teachers and parents that we've had coming forward, because it's teachers and parents together who've made this change and challenged the system that is stopping progress. I'm really proud of them all. I'm really proud of the work that a lot of the politicians have done who are working cross-party to an agreement. It's an amazing thing to see in the New South Wales Parliament, and it is about inclusion. Because previous to this, it's been integration, which is not inclusion, which keeps children isolated, which keeps attitudes of damage in place. And yes, the inquiry's had some great findings from it, but it can't change things at the past. It can't change the fact that after 4 years, there are cases I know of where 3-year-old non-verbal children were assaulted, it's alleged, by staff in schools, and the department won't deal with it. And Rob Stokes still hasn't dealt with it. But this will hopefully make it an improvement for the future for many children and teachers.
There must be people sitting at home thinking, this can't be right. You know, this report says that there's an unacceptable level of allegations of bullying, the use of restraints and seclusion on children. Is the picture genuinely this bad?
Yes. It is in certain places. There are some fantastic schools out there.
And what makes the difference? Because parents talk about a lottery. Parents talk about, you know, it's almost spinning a wheel to find a school where their child can get that legal right to the education or not.
Well, speaking across Australia to people, including, you know, people like Tanya Plibersek, we know it's probably principals that make a difference. We can see a direct change happening within a school when the principal changes. The staff are good. The majority of staff want to keep their heads down and work hard. They're scared if they whistle blow, we know they will then get targeted and they will get removed from the school by whichever means, legal or otherwise, that can be done. But when a principal realises that actually inclusion works for the school community, it works for the children, and it works for business and society in the long run because of the inclusion effects afterwards, then you can actually have it happen quite simply with not much cost.
James, you pretty quickly get to the question, what is inclusion? Some of those children in the package we saw were included in their local school, but it wasn't successful. So is inclusion about sort of goodwill and rainbows and unicorns, or is it about some sort of structural change? You talk to employers, they deal with disability employment. What is inclusion?
Well, we're very focused on practical assistance to employers, to business people, to help them, first of all, gain confidence about offering employment opportunities to people with disabilities, because the sad fact is, for too many people in the workplace, business people, they may not have had very much contact. They might have prejudices, biases about people, and fears. Yes, that's right. So we actually came out with a guide some years ago called Employing Outside the Box. We're working with the federal government at the moment on looking at improving employment outcomes for people with disabilities, and a lot of our members are actually working in that area. So there's a structural thing, there's a practical thing there, but inclusiveness is critical to successful workplaces. It doesn't make sense for Australia as a country to turn its back on part of its people who can make a real contribution to the workforce. And we all know that one of the best things you can do for someone to help them be included is to help them get a job.
Jason, if I can turn to you, we saw in that story that parents have not been, by and large, thumping the table. Now, in part, that's because the person that they need to complain to, outside of, you know, some of the excellent schools that offer education, if there is a complaint, they have to complain to the person that they wish to complain about. But what do you think accounts for that in Australia, that there's not a willingness to say, I demand my rights here?
Well, I think the challenge is for parents in that situation is that if they do go into a school and demand things, they might end up getting nothing. They might end up getting more marginalised, and that's not a situation that we want at all. And I think, you know, looking here in Victoria, I congratulate David and New South Wales on getting the inquiry up, and I think that Victoria and indeed other states could really learn a lot from this. Here in Victoria, we too have had some scandals and some shocking news reports of abuse of children with disabilities in schools. And I think that sometimes it can come down to the way in which schools are funded. We have an issue here in Victoria with schools being funded not necessarily because of the needs of a student, but rather it can be political and it can be open to abuse, where we have pork barrelling of money pouring into some schools and other schools getting completely neglected.
How is that possible? We all keep hearing about the billions of dollars in Gonski funding, and yet there was a particular teacher giving evidence to this inquiry who said, I had a cohort of Down syndrome students 20 years ago and they had a teacher aide 4 days a week. Now, those students don't qualify for any assistance in the classroom. I mean, how is that possible?
Because there's a rationalisation that goes on, and there is suspected pork barreling that goes on in New South Wales as well. One of the good things from this inquiry is that they're saying that all funding must be accounted for and reported on, which it's not being done so far.
But how does that help the teacher who gives evidence to this inquiry, who maybe half agreed with Pauline Hanson a couple of weeks ago when she came out and said autistic children are disruptive in the classroom? She then went on to say, and should be excluded. But if you do not have the funding, and if you have teachers putting their hands up and saying, after a generation of inclusion, we haven't had any adequate training in special education, you know, how can you have a situation where it's going to be successful?
Well, that's why we have to change the system. That's why they're saying funding must be put in place, teachers must be supported, teachers must be given training, universities have to play their part.
But haven't you heard this all before in 5 other inquiries? That
they've not been this specific, and I think this inquiry is going to lead the other inquiries that need to happen in Victoria and Queensland and Western Australia and the other states, or potentially for a Royal Commission, which is what's been called now federally by quite a few parties, because we know this is a systemic problem across Australia. And by actually making these changes, and I think the government will adopt the recommendations that are being made, because they are just recommendations. The government has to actually apply them now here in New South Wales. If it actually goes into place, then it will make a significant difference, because the Ombudsman is making changes, and that, I think, is one of the key reports that's come through, the changes that they have suggested.
James, do we put too much emphasis on principals and teachers within this system? And again, I've got to emphasise that the inquiry found that there were areas of excellence as well as many students who were being left behind. Is it just the principal, or is it an issue for the PNC when you have a situation in Australia where 18.5% of us have a disability, but there's almost a situation that you know, if you're not neurotypical, well, that's unusual. What a strange thing, really.
Look, I'd like to think that as a community we're becoming much more aware of, understanding of and embracing of the diversity in all its different manifestations. Well, I think we're being better educated. I think we're becoming more attuned to the fact that we are a very diverse community. And we're also recognising that to get the best, to be the best that we can as a people, and to get the best out of people, we need to be inclusive. I think the principal's role, leadership is always important. It's important in a school. It's so important in a business, which is what I'm most familiar with. And leadership sets the tone. Leadership sets the example of what's acceptable and what's not. And so in businesses, if they're in a position to provide employment opportunities, for example, to people with disabilities, role modelling by the leader of the organisation is critical. You mentioned the parents and citizens, the PNC. Well, of course they've got to be closely involved. In fact, I can't see how you would have successful outcomes in a school without strong community involvement. So it's that combination of things, but clearly leadership plays a key role. And look, I'd like to think that our organisation is doing its part in doing that.
Jason, you know, you were the first Aussie rules player in Australia to come out as gay. Is that correct?
Yep, at any level of the game, not a single male player has ever come out at the elite level, and by doing so back in 2012, I kind of, I guess, filled the void with no other stories like that, sharing my story of coming out in country Victoria.
And you know, I'm trying to think of how to structure this question, but is there a risk if you say to a group of people who have been marginalised, whether it's children with living with a disability or a learning difficulty, whether it's LGBTI folk in the community, you can feel safe to step forward, but you don't make any structural change to the environment they're stepping into, that's actually worse than nothing?
I think that's actually what's so important about what's happened in New South Wales here, is that we've actually have a chance to talk about some of those structural issues. In Victoria, when we've had scandals, it's only because of those scandals that we have the conversation, and we're talking about things when they get to crisis point, and we're talking about crisis management, not talking about preventing these issues before they come to pass.
Well, if you're going to be really honest, David, would it be honest for a principal to say to a parent, notwithstanding the legal right that your child has to come to this school, we're not equipped to deal with your child and therefore go away? Would that be an honest response, do you think?
I think they'd have to have very, very good reasons to justify it, and that's part of what the inquiry is.
But is that acceptable?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
I taught for 17 years. I was yet to come across one child I could not include in my teaching practice in my classroom. And I mean include, not just have in the corner with a teacher's aide, I mean fully include.
So what prevents, people of goodwill who would like to say, yes, we're inclusive, who cannot live up to that?
I believe it's an attitude. I think they want to do the right thing. I think if you actually really want to do something, you will actually find the method and means. And if you approach your principal and say, I need support, I need this piece of equipment, I need this extra time, I need a learning support officer to work with all the children, including the child with the particular need, and I can use my pedagogical expertise to really focus on that child and therefore lift the whole class.
And is that why parents talk about a lottery? Because you either find the educational leader who's going to do that, or you don't?
Because in many schools they do not allow enrolment. They say there's a better school down the road. So that's the lottery that they have. And that's actually a breach of law.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I put a final question to you in terms of the role of special education? That question that sort of Pauline asked a couple of weeks ago. Can we just segregate these children? I mean, if we were to actually sort of infuse that with a little bit of goodwill and say, look, is there a role for special education anymore? The inquiry heard a view that not every school suits every child. They heard from a woman called Dr. Coral Kemp, who's an honorary fellow at the Department of Educational Studies at Macquarie University, who said there are some kids, and she'll say to the parents, you need to put that child back in the mainstream. He or she will benefit from the mainstream. But for other kids, she says, I've seen tragic situations in the mainstream because teachers do not know what they are doing. Do not forget that inclusion, she says, is about inclusion in life, not just in education.
I don't think we can just take every kid and say, now you're all going to mainstream, because we actually have to make sure our staff feel confident and are trained and are supported in including all children. But we need to be putting children into the mainstream, because if we segregate, if we exclude, that carries forward into the wider society and community. Should we maybe exclude people because of their gender, their hair colour, their race, their religion? We're not allowed to do that anymore, and rightly so. We should be including everyone, whatever the difference about them is, and the benefit that they bring, because we need to stop seeing certain children as being a deficit, as being a problem. What about the benefits that they bring to the classroom, either in their own personal skills or the skills that they will bring out in others? And you can look at multiple YouTube clips, look at my Twitter feed, you will see those clips.
Why is this report going to make a difference? I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff about, perhaps there should be more education of teachers after a generation of having special ed, children with additional needs in the classroom. Where is the impetus going to come from for change? Because at the other end of the special needs spectrum, at gifted and talented, we seem to be able to do that okay with selective schools and all the rest.
Yeah, and that's another form of segregation that damages the mental health of a lot of children in the gifted and talented.
So what makes the difference here?
Because the parties have agreed. These recommendations are agreed across the parties, apart from one. One disagreement is that there is a statement saying that maybe we should be giving the same funding secondary-wise to secondary children with a disability, because at the moment the report says just give them the primary funding, which means there's an inequity there. But every other point, every other recommendation is agreed across all the parties. And I actually believe that, unlike the previous Education Minister, my opinion is quite well known on that one, I believe Rob Stokes has a chance here to prove himself as someone who actually cares about all the kids in our community.
We will see. Well, next, what happens when sport and politics mix? Australia's major sporting codes have been lining up to publicly endorse same-sex marriage, with the NRL, Rugby Union, Cricket Australia doing so in the last couple of weeks, while the heads of soccer's FFA and AFL declare their support a few years ago. But the AFL's recent decision to superimpose the word yes over the logo at their headquarters has caused division among fans and clubs, with prominent former players and members speaking out against a unified stance on the issue. If we can start with you there, Jason. There is a sense of tribalism in football. And look, I'm a rugby league supporter. It's nothing to the sense of tribalism that you get with AFL. If a fan says no, can you understand that they might be distressed if their club and the code say yes so publicly?
Well, if you want to talk about distress, I think about when I was 12 years old, struggling to come to terms with who I was, and especially in that football environment, hearing words like faggot and poofter, whether it's coming from over the fence or coming from the opposition or from my coach or even my own teammates. And every time I heard that language, it felt like a reminder that if anyone found out that I was gay, that I wouldn't be accepted. I felt like I had to choose between the game that I loved and being myself. And so I'm incredibly proud to see the AFL taking this really strong stance in support of marriage equality. This is not some abstract political concept. We're not asking them to solve the Middle East crisis. This is an issue that fundamentally affects the lives of their players, of many of their fans, and their staff. And so, of course, they should be coming out in support of them and their fundamental human rights.
So,
I have some slight problems with the yes on the AFL. I have no problem at all with the multiple, each individual club coming out and saying yes, like Qantas coming out. But because the AFL represents the full code, therefore there are a number of people who might feel marginalised in a different way that might go, is my voice not part of this community then? So I just think it's okay for them to maybe make a statement saying we support equity, because of course I support equity in every aspect of life, but turning the logo into a giant yes, it just brings concerns.
James?
Look, every organisation needs to make these kinds of decisions for themselves. It's the same thing that applies to business. A community-based organisation like a sporting code or a club, if it chooses to take a position on an issue such as this, you'd imagine that they'd consult with their members, they'd think carefully about how their support base, their fans and their employees, for example, are going to feel, are going to be affected by it, and they'd think through what the consequences of their positioning would be. But they have every right to do that if they choose to do that.
But see, Jennifer Westacott was on the radio this morning. She's the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia. She's a gay woman. She says she's felt like an outsider her whole life. Because her long-term 30-year relationship is not treated with the same respect and legitimacy given to married couples. And she says, now it's not fair that business can speak out on gender equality, women in leadership, the arts, the community, but they can't speak out on marriage equality. Does business have to be careful about that? I mean, if you're going to take a stance on all of these things, can you say, but we have nothing to say about marriage equality?
I think it's up to each individual business. If they're a publicly owned business, a corporation, for example, they'll think about what's in the best interest of their shareholders, what's in the best interest of their employees, their workforce, and they'll think about the implications of the decision they take. But it's up to every business, man and woman, and business as an entity, to make that decision themselves. It's their right to decide to get involved. It's their right to decide not to get involved.
And Jason, what about people who say, listen, mate, I just want to go to the footy and I don't want it to get political?
Well, to anyone who's going to go along to the finals this weekend, there's not going to be a single second less of football played because of the decision that the AFL made here today. And when you're thinking about the AFL, just like any other company, like Qantas, like Holden, who have come out in support of marriage equality for the sake of their employees, for the sake of their customer base, and when you're thinking about them taking strong stance on things like gender equality will mean a huge deal for women in the workforce. It won't take away anything from men, and marriage equality will mean a huge deal for same-sex attracted couples who want their love to be recognised in the same way that straight couples have that same opportunity, and that will take nothing away from straight relationships.
I know that you work with Beyond Blue. We're looking at a situation here where there has been a backlash against the AFL, putting the Yes logo on. You've also spoken about the number of people who are in the closet who play for the AFL and for Aussie rules generally. What impact does this debate have on their ability to be themselves at work?
Well, being in the closet, I can tell you from experience, is not a pleasant experience. I remember always second-guessing everything that I said or did. I remember not getting involved in conversations about relationships, and it probably limited the kinds of friendships and bonds that I could have developed with my teammates while I was growing up, and it certainly affected my ability to perform on the field. And the best thing about my experience is that when I came out, it wasn't a big deal to my teammates, and a lot of the fears that I had weren't realised. I learned that a lot of the homophobic language and behaviour that I was seeing was coming from a place of ignorance as opposed to a place of hatred towards me. And reflecting on that, thinking about when I was struggling to come to terms with who I was, if I had have known of such thing as a gay footballer, if I had have known he could be out to his teammates and it wouldn't be a big deal, you know, that would have made a really big difference to me.
And is there a sense for you that footy is the final frontier? It's seen as such a blokey sort of a culture, or is that not the culture that you know as a player?
Look, if you look at the research, blokiness is one thing, homophobia is another, and we know from the research that 80% of people have experienced or witnessed homophobia in sport, and the impact that that has is that 9 out of 10 young people who are gay and play sport feel like they need to be in the closet or they stop playing sport at one point in their life. And anyone out there who loves sport, who plays sport, understands the benefits that come from participating in sport, whether it's the physical activity or the social aspects that come from playing, especially in a team sport. So to feel like you can't be yourself in sport or to feel like you're excluded from sport just further compounds the negative mental health outcomes that the LGBTI community already experience.
Well, let's wrestle with one more issue before we go. We have 3 blokes on the panel, so why not discuss the contents of a Canberra Liberal politician who, in a parliamentary debate about social inclusion, lamented the exclusion of straight white men. Mark Pearson was responding to initiatives for the inclusion of women, the LGBTI community and other groups in Canberra's society.
If you are a heterosexual employed white male over the age of 30, you're not really included in anything. Now, I know that those on the other side would say that heterosexual employed Anglo males have opportunities aplenty, so we don't need to look after them. They'll be okay. Well, Madam Assistant Speaker, let me tell you that 75% of suicides in this country are men, and overwhelmingly they are men 30 to 54.
James, sometimes when we have, as we did earlier this week, a Muslim woman on the panel in a headscarf, we'll have a response from people, and often they're men or Anglo women, saying that's not, it's tokenistic, it's not normal, it's not right. Is there a sense, do you think, among certain people that they feel they're being displaced?
Look, I think that the evidence is in, and that is that if you're a white middle-aged man who's gainfully employed, then you're comparatively better off than a lot of other groups in society. Hypothetically, yes. Well, I resemble that remark. But I think the point to be made, and actually the MP who made these comments did make the point, which I hadn't realised in the original news reports. He made a point about male suicide. One of the big changes I've noticed over the last decade or so in our country is that it's now much easier for men to face up to, admit and go and talk to someone about issues they have with health, mental health, but physical health as well. And look, I've been in businesses that have actually had outreach programs to encourage men to get a checkup, and they call it like going in for a checkup for your car, going up for a tune-up. So it's good that we're talking about issues that affect men, but I reckon we should also reckon, and back to the issue of inclusion, that there's space for everyone.
What drives, do you think, that despair, Jason, among young men that drives them to take such drastic actions? The suggestion there is it's an issue of they don't see themselves represented, but surely that's not it.
Well, I mean, they certainly are represented. You can look at the boards of all of the top companies, you can see that, you know, straight white men over the age of 30 certainly are represented. But it is actually an important point when you're looking at the mental health statistics here, but it's not exclusion, or it's not a lack of privilege that lead to higher suicide rates, but rather it is ideas around masculinity, where in the Aussie bloke you can't show emotion, and you're less likely to reach out for help, and you're more likely to spiral out of control if you do have a mental health issue.
Very good. Thank you for that. We are out of time. I'm sorry, David. Are you okay might be the answer to the question. That's it for The Drum. Thanks to our panel to David, James and Jason in Melbourne. I'll see you again tomorrow night. Good night.